Hello and welcome to the next season of the Great Legal Mind Show. Today, I have with me Mr. Akil Hirani. He's the managing partner of Majmudar and Partners. Akil, a very warm welcome to to this podcast that we've started very recently, and thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you so much, Aman, for having me here. Pleasure to be with you and look forward to an interesting conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Akil, tell me something about Majmudar and Partners first. In fact, it needs no introduction, of course. This is fairly, old firm. But if you could actually go over that very quickly and tell us something about yourself, that'll be a good start.
Sure. So, Majmudar is a very sort of historical boutique law firm in the Mumbai market, traditionally a solicitor's firm, and for many of our new listeners or viewers who are not so conversant with the term solicitor, it's, a classic Mumbai qualification, which was similar to what you got in England back in the day. So that's what the firm sort of did for a number of decades, mainly banking, litigation, finance, and which is what most of the firms in Mumbai did, in the 1940s and 50s and onwards. But today, I think, most of the senior folks have all, departed for their heavenly abode. And so it's a fairly, I would say, a young firm with a very modern outlook. And so we've kept our brand and our name. We haven't changed it. And in fact, our name often gets confused for Majumdar. And
Exactly.
so
I
people
also
think,
had the same
yeah,
thing actually,
yeah,
but then we realized that there are, they are from two different parts of the country, Majumdar and
indeed.
Majmudar.
Indeed. So sometimes, in fact, on Google searches, the biggest hits to our website are when you key in Majumdar, coincidentally. That's what a consultant told us.
And
So
I'll
it's
tell you
it's quite
some very
hilarious.
interesting anecdote here. In fact,
Yeah.
I got to know about Majmudar when I was watching this Shah Rukh Khan movie called Rais. And there
Uh-huh.
was this police guy whose name was Majmudar. And then I realized that, this is actually from that, western part of the country
True.
that, it's a
True.
different name altogether.
No, indeed, indeed. So, anyways, that's the firm. So, in terms of my own background, I mean, I became a lawyer in the 90s, qualified in Mumbai, and then went on and qualified in England and Wales as well, became a solicitor there, which was quite easy in those days where you had to take one exam to transfer over there because they recognized the Bombay solicitor's qualification. And then from there, I actually went on to California. I, took the bar exams in California. And I was actually a litigator in my formative life. And so my basic training was in litigation, and I even appeared in the Bombay High Court. And in California, I actually was a law clerk with a judge. So I lived in the Bay Area for a couple of years and spent some time and got some great experience there. So came back, and that's really when it was the late 90s. There was the first technology boom was underway, and all of these large companies were investing in India, trying to do things in India. And that's really when I felt that my heart actually lay in the M&A side of things, and in the especially the cross-border advisory side of things. And so we, because of my California connections and background, we landed a big client, Microsoft, in those days, and we set up their R&D center in Hyderabad. And so that was the start of the switch and the journey, into the whole M&A corporate side of things.
No, that's quite interesting. In fact, I'm going to come back to you, but I think I have one more question related to the name of the firm, even though the conversation has moved, and which is that, you know, the I think firm was founded by your late father, Mr. Ahmad Hirani, right?
Actually, no. So it was
Okay.
founded by Mr. Majmudar in the 1940s. And then my father, along with another partner, joined Mr. Majmudar in the 70s. And then Mr. Majmudar passed away in the 80s, and the name and the goodwill continued. So they were all partners for a period of time in the firm. And so that's how the name Majmudar has come about and has continued.
Oh, okay. So that is the story. That's an interesting one.
Yeah.
Okay, so coming back to your, M&A background, I think let's do a bit of an explainer today for the younger audience today. I think it'll be a good fun for them to understand the M&A part in, more simple language, in a more fun way. Now, let me actually start with, asking you what is the first ever deal that made you think that this is a great beginning for me, and this is where I actually should be moving on this path of, being an M&A lawyer.
Sure. So again, want to go back to the late 90s for this. There was a big US company, aluminum company called Southwire, and they were from the southern part of the US. And they were looking to do an acquisition stroke a joint venture with an Indian company called Pennar Aluminum. And this was, a very the early stage, right, where India was liberalizing and, people were investing, but everyone was skeptical about India. India, will our IP be protected? They were going to do a technology license. How are they going to secure their technology? And the whole trust building part of it, right? And so I think, that to me was a very seminal moment because, in a way, when we were negotiating, we actually were acting as an ambassador, right, for our country and telling the counterparties and telling our client, also the American company, that, it's not all that bad in India. This is a country where business has been done now for a few centuries and not everybody's out to thieve and steal from you. And how do you build that trust? And then of course you obviously get into the documentation and the negotiations. But I think for me that was a moment where I felt that this is fun, right? I mean, you are a lawyer, but you're actually also a bit of an ambassador, and you're also positioning something positive for your country.
Absolutely, absolutely. When you actually go out of India into different countries, you know, you have to sell the country first before you sell your services for sure. Okay, so let's actually now look at the M&A part and be explaining the whole thing. Now, let's say, for example, any company that is, wanting to buy another company or wanted to kind of, merge the two companies. What is the first ever step that they have to take?
So, very simplistically, Aman, an M&A is like a shadi, like a marriage. Okay. So when you were young, or when I was young and we were out looking for a bride for ourselves, what did we look for, right? I mean, you really need to analogize on that basis. It's a very simplistic way to look at it, but that's literally what it is. So you want a beautiful bride, you want her to be educated, all of that good stuff, right? So a deal or a merger is basically just that, right? You are looking to expand into maybe a new territory, you want a new product, it needs to have value, it needs to accrete to you in the long run, it needs to build your bottom line. So those are the fundamental premises of an M&A or an amalgamation or however you want to call it in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one. And once you find that, in fact, there are divorces also that happen, but we will talk about them later. But tell me, what are different kind of, M&A transactions that actually happen?
Sure. So you have, of course, two sets, right? You have the public M&A deals, which are more for the public listed companies. And then you have a whole body of private M&A, which are more on the private side of things. So however you slice and dice it, there are about three or four main types of deals that take place. One are the mergers or amalgamations, which are court approved or NCLT approved with the tribunal. And those have certain tax advantages. And so a lot of the larger companies prefer to do those kinds of deals. Then you have a basic stock purchase deal, right? Where a company just wants to buy a company's shares and then becomes the owner of that company by virtue of a stock purchase. Then you also have slightly more complicated deals like a business transfer deal. So, in a stock purchase deal, you buy the shares and then you not only become the owner of the company, but also you inherited the liabilities of the company. So if you don't want to inherit the liabilities, but you like a particular business in a company, then you don't buy shares, but you simply just buy the business. And that business gets carved out from the selling company and becomes a part of your company. So that's another way to do it. Now, if you don't even want the entire business, and if you only want piecemeal assets, which is what we are now seeing in the tech and the AI world
Right.
today, where teams have become very important, right? And so all the big tech and other companies purely want a team. They don't want to be bothered with the company. They don't want to be bothered with the existing business of a company, but the team is good. So I'm going to get the team as an asset. And so those become another type of transaction. And then linked to that is also what we call the acqui-hire, where again, like key personnel are just being hired, right? And you're seeing this a lot in Silicon Valley. You're seeing it in India as well, where, Meta has gone in and, just taken the chief AI officer from company X and put them into their AI team, right? And that's like an acqui-hire with just that person, and you're giving the selling company a little bit of value for training and whatever they've done for the selling company. So we're seeing some of those variations as well these days.
So that is basically hiring only, but then with consent of the company where the person is working.
Indeed. And giving them some premium for it too, because obviously they're poaching from that company in a way without really calling it that. But for the company also, it can be a win-win, because if that guy is not bringing the value to that company, then they are monetizing that asset in their own way. Of course, it's a human asset here. Yeah.
And sometimes companies don't even have the choice. I mean, if the person has to go, has to go. So you make the most of, that opportunity. So,
And also, sorry, just
yeah.
to add, a lot of these companies tend to also be venture backed. And so if the business is not doing well, but you've got your key people who do carry value, then from a VC standpoint also it becomes a win-win, because hey, you're getting some money at least for this piece of your pie, right?
So what are some of the examples here? Any, thing that you must have seen in the recent past in India?
You're seeing this in the GCC world, and as you know, Aman, GCCs are coming into India in a big way. And they're not just
That's
the
right.
tech GCCs, but financial services, industrials. So that's really where we're seeing some of this, where they're then going to some of the more small to medium-sized companies, especially down south in Hyderabad, Chennai, Bangalore, where the tech and AI and those markets are much more robust. And then they're pulling people and teams on the back of this model, right? And trying to then not get into all these disputes relating to non-competes and non-solicits, so it's a negotiated sort of transaction. I won't be able to give names, but that's the sector in which you're seeing it the most.
Sure, sure, sure. And in fact, Akil, there is another terminology called reps and warranties. That sounds very scary. If you could actually, decipher that a bit for our viewers.
I'll just go back to my marriage example again. It's like, you promise to take care of your wife and to do good to the family and so on. So a rep basically is a promise that you're giving, saying that you have kept this company in good stead, and it whatever you are giving is what the company is. And so basically you're saying that, I represent, truthfully, that the business has been done properly, this is my turnover, these are my assets. So it's just a promise. If you breach the promise, then going back to the divorce scenario, that would be the most egregious outcome. But in the meantime, you can sue them for a breach of the promise, and that, okay, you said this was what the case was, this didn't happen. So, great examples of a breach of rep, like what we've seen in India, has been that, Daiichi case,
The
and where the
Ranbaxy one?
Ranbaxy deal, exactly, right? And so that went into arbitration, of course, but the whole premise was that in information which was of the FDA, right? The FDA US, the Food and Drugs Authority, they had suppressed that information from Daiichi that there had been a review and there were proceedings and so on, and that came out later, and the plant was shut and lots of issues happened. And so that's what Daiichi really, what that was a main, ground. And then they, of course, got damages also for it. So that's what a rep is, and a warranty as well in that sense.
Okay, okay. Now, in fact, another very important part here is that, if you could actually talk a little about the due diligence that you actually do before, finalizing a deal. If you could actually speak a little more about the due diligence in the sense that, you know,
Yeah.
what all is done, and in today's scenario, with technology coming in, how the time period that was taken earlier is shortened, and so on and so forth. If you could actually explain that
Sure,
for
sure, sure.
us.
No, so I think due diligence is probably one of the most important facets of a transaction. Oftentimes it gets compromised because people want to do it quick and dirty, or they want to just get the deal done. But in my view, I think it's a very critical part of a deal, especially when the deals are large, if they comprise real estate assets. In India, often we have title issues, and those become very critical. And also in terms of compliances and company law compliances, FEMA compliances, I think those are extremely serious these days. And both the Registrar of Companies and the RBI are coming down hard for any breaches, much more than what they used to before. So I think it's an investigation into the health of a company. It is done in three or four different buckets. One is your reputational health, which I know you all are focusing on that in a big way, but that's a very important aspect of it. Are your promoters who you're going to be buying into or you're going to tie up with, have they had any political connections? What are their problems, if any? Have there been in investigations or criminal actions, particularly? So that's one part of it. Lawyers often don't get involved in that, but we oversee some of that. The second, of course, important part of it is the financial piece as well, which really decides on the value and the valuation of a business. And so are you, your tax compliances, your tax filings, your tax disclosures. Oftentimes, as you know, in India, or at least historically, when I was as a young lawyer, I used to have two sets of books for every companies, right? You had the official ones and then you had the unofficial ones, right? Okay. I think India has come a long way since, and I'm happy
Yeah,
to
yeah,
note that we have all progressed into a more official way of doing business.
yeah.
But you did, as an accountant, need to understand if there were things which are not on the books, right? So financial due diligence and valuation becomes an important part. And then, of course, last but not the least is the legal piece. And that's where we come in. And so, as I said, checking the past records, the company filings, the Reserve Bank of India filings, the contracts, your material contracts become important. Because if you're saying that you have X and Y customers, and if they constitute 50% of your business, then how robust are those contracts? How long will they last? So, ensuring that not just the legalese is correct, but even the commercials tie up, right? I mean, because if you are getting into a renewal cycle, right? And suppose you don't, like, if you're buying Infosys, and Infosys and all these big IT companies have renewal cycles, and if you're buying at the fag end of your cycle, and if 10 or 20% of those customers don't renew, then you have a big problem in terms of a hole in your revenue, right? So those things become important even from a legal standpoint. So I think, yeah, that's really what it is. In India, as you know, the saying is, the buyer beware. So as a buyer of a business, you really need to beware through diligence and, coming up with checking all the boxes.
And so this is great. In fact, you put all the information on the table. Then it depends upon the, acquirer, how much, to kind of, they, you know, give importance to each of those topics. And then, if they must acquire, then, how much they can overlook and so on and so forth, right? I mean, I think deals still go through, even if, there's a bit of a, thing that is not so favorable in due diligence. Have you seen any, that kind of situation where, the due diligence is not 10 on 10, but still the deal has gone through? And what could be the risks?
No, I'm just absolutely. So, look, deals go through, as you rightly said, even if diligence is not 10 on 10. And in fact, in most cases, it is never 10 on 10, because in most markets, and especially markets like India, where we've been evolving, right, in our journey through laws and regulations and compliances, and we are now becoming more of a rule-based society. So there is no way that you will find historical 100% compliance anywhere. So I think what I would like to put on the table is that a deal or an M&A transaction is basically risk mitigation. And that is the approach which you need to take. And so assume there is a tax problem, right? And assume that they have an assessment reopened from 3 years ago. So what is my liability going to be, right? Assume they withheld info. And so assume you can quantify that, you can quantify the penalties for that, and if a number can be arrived at. So maybe I can then look at putting that amount into an escrow account for a period of 5 years. Because I'm now
Right.
buying your company, the liability has become mine, but it is not my liability today, right? It should not have been my liability. So I'm going to
Right.
park maybe 20% of your funds into escrow. If the taxman actually comes after me, then I will pay that money from the escrow. If the matter is resolved in your favor, I will refund the money back to you, right? So that can be a great workaround. Smaller issues like, land title, for example, there is no, you go to tier two, tier three cities or the rural areas, nothing is clear, right? There's uncles, aunties, different
Yep.
people owning land, right? And so
Absolutely.
you're never going to get like anyone who's going to say, no, this is 100% clear and, everything is good. So then you will work on maybe an indemnity, which is again, a common tool that we use. That look, if tomorrow an uncle or an aunt or anybody pops up and makes a claim on this land, then you have to indemnify me, right? And if there's any damage or if there's litigation, then you will step into my shoes and you fight this out because again, I am contracting you for a clear title. So deals are often these are all the workarounds and many others of this nature. But deals are done regularly, keeping in mind that you're aware of the risk and you mitigate the risk.
And Akhil, tell me something like, if, say, for example, on an average here, due diligence is 7 on 10. In more developed nations, what is the kind of, trend that you're seeing in terms of compliances, etc.? Is it because we have too many compliances, or, like, for example, you talked about the land and all of that. Is that the situation in more developed markets as well?
Not to the same extent, I would say. So
Okay.
you will have, so if you just continue on the land example, your title issues that you see in India are very typical to India, just because of the way it has evolved in India, right? Because as the population increased, land was divided among seven siblings, for example, and so it became a very narrow and broken down. Overseas, it's much more corporatized, and land holdings are for larger tracts also. So the challenges are not, and everything is computerized. It's been computerized for a number of decades, right?
Yes.
So ownership is very easy to figure out overseas. The challenges overseas lie on environmental concerns, which are also increasingly becoming our concerns here. And so, two things, the environment and eminent domain, right? And so, did the municipal authorities need that land or was it marked for a certain purpose in the land records? And so, is that a purpose that can revive and, become an issue? Or, what happened on the land, right? Was there a factory 100 years ago, 50 years ago? Did they put things in the soil? And so is there a pollution hazard that happens here? And because for that, you can get sued today. So assume you were a developer in America and you bought a whole land parcel, which was industrial, and now it's been cleaned or whatever, or it appears to be clean. But tomorrow, if some fumes came out of the land and somebody got cancer, you're in for a few $100 million, if not $1 billion of a lawsuit the very next day, right? So in India, luckily or unluckily, we are not at that stage yet. But I think environmental issues are now becoming relevant over here as well. And especially where a lot of our industrial land is being converted into residential, especially in our cities also, And but those are the differences, I would say.
Okay, okay. And so, and now, in fact, my next question is that how do you actually put value uh, on a target when you're going for the acquisition? What are the methods that you choose to kind of assess that, okay, this is what one should actually be paying for this?
So again, valuation is, more an art than a science, although there are enough, valuation formulas available.
So, in fact,
In
just sorry, one question here is that is it like, how much of this is your domain and how much of this is, chartered accountant's domain or the valuation agency's domain?
So our on the valuation, our domain or the legal domain in general is less so. I think we look at it more from a regulatory standpoint, right? And so if you're doing a cross-border deal, foreign exchange regulations require to do a fair market valuation on an internationally acceptable arm's length basis, right? So whatever is a proper model available globally is the model you have to apply. You can't undervalue your shares. And then the buyer has to pay that as a minimum, or of course, he can pay more than that, but that has to be a minimum. So our role is to ensure the FEMA compliance. So the heavy lifting on the valuation is done by either the investment banker or the merchant banker or the chartered accountant. But just from experience, right? Typically, if it's a listed company, then you will look at what is the similarly placed listed companies, what are they trading at, and then you try
Right.
and use a benchmark from there. If it is unlisted, then what is a multiple that you will give to the earnings, right? Because typically everything works on an earnings,
Right.
and or if it's a sales, then some industries work on a sales multiple. So those are the ways in which valuations are arrived at.
Okay, okay, excellent. So, Akhil, I think let's now talk about some of the real cases or case studies. So, for example, from corporate governance point of view, would you want to take up any like one thing that comes to my mind is Byju's. In fact, on Byju's, even from communication point of view, I had actually done like a podcast as to how it was a media's darling at one point of a time to being like a total um, you know PR disaster at one point of time. Uh, but I think at the core of it is the corporate governance side. If you would want to kind of say something on that.
Sure. No, I think it's a classic case of exuberance, right? And hubris. And so, of course, we had, uh, Baiju was a poster child, right? The story was fantastic. Teacher from Kerala, smart, articulate, built this whole business and, started doing really well. And of course, he was on a great trajectory. And then all the investors started coming in, and then came COVID, and then COVID, everybody was at home, children were at home, everybody was schooling online, and the numbers totally ratcheted up. More money started piling in, and that's really where the trouble began, right? Because suddenly now everybody was falling head over. It was like the FOMO, right? Everyone is falling head over heels because billions of dollars evaluation, good money to be made. But that's really where things went awry because the paperwork was not kept up to date, right? So agreements were not, completed. New investors were just being given one-pager documents referring to some shareholders agreement who nobody had seen because nobody was being either allowed it to be seen, or it was just like, okay, it's there, we'll figure it out, right? And diligence, as we discussed, was non-existent because everyone's trying to cut the next check, trying to make the next buck, and so on, right? So that really, and then of course the investors came on the board as well. And then when things started going south, right, COVID ended, numbers started slowing down a little bit. A lot of expensive acquisitions had been made. And that's really when, as a founder, I think Baiju felt he was not in control, right? Because obviously it'd been diluted and you've got all these third parties on the board who are all trying to, tell you what to do. And sometimes as a founder, you then, just decide that, hey, I've had enough. And so I think another big mistake that happened was that all the board members quit the board, on one given day. And then it was just the founders and the family who were on the board. So now you have zero visibility on what is actually happening, right? And so those were some of the missteps, right? And we were involved. I mean, this is all a matter of the public domain. So us and various of our other peer firms were all involved in this matter. And it has been tough for the investors because to justify and to prove a case, you will need to eventually, documents will be tested and evidence will have to be led. And all of that so looks, not so easy, right? When you haven't taken the right steps throughout.
Absolutely. I think this is such a great story, but ended up really badly. Tell me something like, from another big segment is e-commerce here. What are the winners and losers here? I mean, from the, acquisitions and, market scenario point of view. I mean, so many M&As happened there as well. So, where it actually eventually landed, different, players and the overall market.
Sure. So e-commerce again, is a high growth story. And we are now seeing it in the form of quick commerce. I mean, we're all buying on Zepto and Instamart and, all these companies. So, again, going back maybe 5 years or so, direct to consumer had become a big theme. It still is a big theme.
Right.
And, companies were now going to be doing roll-ups, right? They wanted to acquire sellers on Amazon and Flipkart and roll them up and, make them and spruce them up and increase the valuation. So in that model, we were representing, a large company called 30, which was valued at about $10 billion in the US. All again, the big investors were in it. And so they did a very large acquisition in India of a company called Lifelong, which was well publicized. And Lifelong was one of the pioneers of products, and it's a Delhi-based company as well. And so that was done at a very high value because, of course, the multiples in COVID. Again, we were all sitting at home and we were eating and drinking and shopping like there was no tomorrow because there was nothing else to do. So numbers were all looking good, and everybody was again jumping on the bandwagon. But again, after COVID, the reality was a little different. Valuations came off, not just in India but internationally as well, and a number of companies in the D2C space struggled. And so I think it's a stark reminder, right, that for all the early stage and the venture backed businesses, there is still a law of averages that applies. And, it's, maybe 3 out of 10 who may be the gold, silver, and bronze medalists here, but there are 7 who will have just participated in that journey. And so that's really what we saw here. So we did it end to end, right from the entry and then, down to the exit where, everything was then being sold at a much cheaper valuation.
So you've seen actually a lot of these players coming in early, making a lot of money initially, getting a lot of funding, etc., etc. And anyone that you wanted to talk about, if everything, if the things are in public domain, any examples you want to give?
Examples
Anyone?
of people, you mean other clients in this
Yeah,
sector?
yeah,
Or,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Uh, so No, there are a few examples, but I don't think I would be comfortable speaking about them.
Sure. No, that's
If
fine.
that's
That's
okay.
fine. That's fine. In fact, I wanted to also pick up another sector, which is insurance. The
Right.
large insurance JVs that were happening, and now, this was a regulator sector, regulated,
Mhm.
which made M&A mandatory. So, tell me some. I mean, you've, I think, done, fair amount of work in the insurance sector as well. So,
Mhm.
what's been the learning so far over there?
So in insurance is, I would say, a tough and a very arduous sector because firstly, as a business, it's a very long-term game. I mean, insurance is not like e-commerce, which we talked about, or ed tech like Byju's, where 5, 7 years and you can really scale it up. I mean, this is a high capital intensive sector, 20, 25, 30 years, you got to build it out, right? So I think a lot of the trouble, of course, started because, I mean, I wouldn't say trouble, but I think, historically, India's legacy industries like life insurance and the government-owned public sector insurance companies, to change that whole mindset in our economy and move into the private domain was a big thing, right? And this all started in the 90s when the new law came about and stuff. So when I look back 25 odd years, I think India has done a great job in its life cycle in relation to this sector. And now we've actually reached the stage with 100% ownership, right? We went from
Yeah.
24 to 49 to 74 to now 100%. So we are finally there. So I think that is one side of the spectrum. I think the other side of the spectrum has also been the control, the de facto control that the government has wanted the Indian partners to have. And so you had restrictions on your board composition, who your CEO and the key KMP needs to be of Indian, a resident or origin. And you had all those rules. Now, some of those have also been done away with, except for your CEO, CFO level people who need to be of Indian origin. Uh, so I think we've really come a long way. Having said that, though, what we're seeing is that the takers for 100% ownership are still, uh, it's not a floodgate, right? It's not that every JV, every foreign investor wants to go to 100% because I think there are business challenges also in India in terms of insurance sales, in terms of the commissions you can pay to your brokers. There's a lot of regulatory IRDAI overhang in the sector. And so not everyone is comfortable dealing with it as a wholly owned owner. And then you also have to understand that internationally, companies have much higher compliance obligations because these are all Fortune 50, Fortune 100 types of businesses. And so they have the anti corruption and different other compliances, right? And so once you then go to a certain ownership threshold, you have to report the Indian business as a part of your global business. And that reporting then means disclosures. If disclosures have not been 100% in India for various reasons, it can have your ramifications on your stock price in the US or anywhere else. So a lot of other considerations have gone on in this sector. And therefore, I think we've done a great job at the government level. I think IRDI needs to probably free up things a little more from a regulatory standpoint, and I think we'll just see a lot more traction here.
Absolutely. I think, I also worked in insurance sector fair bit from the time when we were actually doing a lot of advocacy for the threshold to be increased, and now this is 100%. And so, does that thing that, the CEO being an Indian one, that still exists despite, 100% FDI allowed in the country?
Yes, yes, that's still.
Okay. Now let's talk about, in fact, you've actually talked about, two, three examples, during the time of COVID, how, in fact, things worked very, very well. But, as COVID started, waning down, the their own businesses also started to kind of, go down. How is the M&A landscape now different post-COVID, even though it's been many years, COVID is behind us, thankfully. But how, the whole M&A scenario has changed, and what are the sectors right now heating up as far as the M&A is concerned? What's your prediction or the trends that you see coming in?
Sure. So I think this would be a good time to actually talk a little bit about the geopolitical scenario. So I would say that last year India was a boom year for M&As in India, and most of the law firms and all the professionals were really busy. A lot of it also continued into 2026, but I think ever since the Iran Israel US effect came into the picture, India did get impacted a little bit, especially in terms of the raw material pricing, in terms of the crude oil pricing, which has been extremely volatile over the last 3-4 months. So I think M&A ultimately is all about value, right? And how do you attribute value to a particular business? And so when you have that kind of volatility, it becomes very difficult to predict what the future will look like for any particular business. And so consequently, I would say in the last 3-4 months, there has been some softness. Although that softness, in my mind, seems to be or will be short-lived. And it's not again across the board, right? I think it's in certain sectors which were impacted, like maybe oil and gas or renewables or the whole crude oil paint businesses and those kinds of businesses. Uh, the sectors which are extremely hot and continue to be hot are AI and tech and services. So we have been crazy busy in those sectors. And add to that, I would say even pharma and life sciences. So I would say, and these are often termed as the new age sectors, right? But I think India has really turned a corner over the last few years in these sectors in particular. And again, in some ways, I think geopolitics is helping India, in these sectors. So what has also happened in the last year is the tightening of people movement, right? Immigration rules are being tightened everywhere. US is a big example where visa fees have gone up. Things are changing, right? But that doesn't mean that business stops, right? Business is going to find a way, just like water finds a way. And so you will go where the talent is, right? And that's really what we're seeing in relation to India. So tech, AI, I mean, the engineering talent, and we have to really thank our forefathers who, built our institutions and where we've got this whole talent pool and this whole education ethic. I think that really forms a bedrock of our society and our economy. And so I think people are coming here for our talent. And so we are seeing a ton of M&A in the AI space because AI talent is scarce. Whether America likes it or not, the number of engineers that it produces in a year is not as high as China or India. And even if everybody starts getting into engineering school over there, there is a lag time before which they come to a certain level. And so, without that talent, you're not going to be in play. And so it's not just tech companies that realize it, but even industrial and non-tech companies are also realizing it. And so they are looking at India also from what can they do in India to lock talent and get good people. So I think that is one play which I think is good. On the pharma life sciences side, I mean, again, look, we are the biggest generic player in the world, and we are supplying medicines to the whole world, Europe, US, Latin America, and many places, right? So we can impose tariffs and we can do whatever we want. But the reality is that India is now a very critical factor in the global pharma chain. And more importantly, it's also now moving higher up on the R&D chain. So a lot of transactions we're seeing is also on the R&D side of things, clinical trials, management, and so on, right? And so I think, and med devices, of course, right, is also a very important area. So that's number two. And number three, I would say, is our consumer economy. I mean, I think, again, going back to COVID, simply because it was such a game changer.
Yeah.
We're all buying more, we're all shopping more. Everybody wants to live today for the today. our younger listeners and viewers are, for the moment people, right? And so that whole spending culture is now, given. So how do you plug into that? This is going to become a wealth creating market, a consumer market. So a lot of brands want to position, and so you're seeing a lot of those kinds of deals also happening. So I'd say there's a lot of positive amidst the geopolitical issues that the world has seen.
So, Akil, with the latest geopolitical situation and the trade restrictions, etc., have you seen any deal that is getting impacted or, being shaped as a consequence of, the whole new world order that we are seeing today?
Yeah, absolutely. No, we are seeing change in structure. I think firstly, we are seeing some delays in some sectors because businesses that were export oriented, and which are going to be hit by tariffs, where private equity funds or, funds were going to be investors, they people want more visibility. So you are definitely seeing some delays on some of those deals. I think in some deals, what we've seen is deals that just got signed, but then suddenly markets changed, right? Because your export market suddenly has now become more expensive. So your profitability model is under pressure. So what we are seeing is reconfiguration of some of those deals, where then companies are saying, okay, how do we explore new markets, right? And so you're seeing a lot more activity in ASEAN, in Africa. And I think those are the more frontier economies, especially in Africa, where a lot more focus is going. So I think deal reconfiguration and contours are changing geographically in these manners.
Okay. Now, in fact, I have a question related to the legal sector because there's a lot of conversations about AI happening and AI adoption in the legal sector happening. How do you think? I mean, we are hearing that, they could do the documents and we talked about due diligence, in a much faster way and this and that. How is the adoption? How do you see the adoption happening of AI right now? Is it like a true adoption? Happening or industry won't take much more time. B, if the adoption is happening, what is the advantage you are getting and what are the advantages your clients are getting as a result of that? If you could, say a few things, I think that'll be quite helpful.
Sure, sure. No, I think AI is here to stay, I think is the first message. I think AI is a great positive in my opinion. Of course, there are some ill effects as well that we could witness, and we have seen some of those. But by and large, I think it's a big positive. In the legal sector, I think AI adoption is increasing quite rapidly, not just in India, but also in the US, Europe, and in various parts of the world. I think you can't look at AI in the law as a holistic discussion item because the law, again, is divided into many different verticals and practices. And so I think the AI use case for your sectors and the areas you practice in is how you got to really focus on. So again, if I look at M&A and the corporate side of things, right, as a first start, I think it's really helped on due diligence for sure. I mean, even before AI came in its current avatar, you had due diligence tools like Relativity, etc., on which you uploaded documents and they gave you keywords and you pulled out the relevant documents which you read through. AI has gone further and it actually can give you summaries and things. But AI is not without error, even today, which we know. So there are hallucinations. There could be documents which didn't get picked up on the review. And so I would say it's a good maybe 6 on 10, right, today. But it's a good 6 on 10, which means that at least 60% of some of the activity that you do can be crunched. So I think it's not taking away any junior lawyer roles. It's maybe making junior lawyers more efficient, is how I would put it. Because earlier, what would take 3 weeks, where a team of 5 or 10 people will be sitting in a data room and reading things and downloading things. that has shortened maybe to 3 days, where AI will give you some summaries and then you start looking at summaries. But you will have to still be investigative, because if something has been missed, then you will have to be, good enough to pick that up, right? So I would say that that's the change. So from a client standpoint, I think it's time efficient, and of course it's cost efficient as well, because oftentimes we're transparent and we say we use this, and and it shows up in your bills. I mean, your billing is more efficient. I think what that does to the revenue model from an M&A standpoint is an open discussion, and I think we may eventually move into more of a value-based billing, where we'll say, okay, this is an environmental due diligence that we need to do, and we will just charge you X fees. Whether we spend 10 hours or whether we use AI, that's all our problem. This is the value and this is the product you're going to get. So I think that's where we may eventually start going in the next 3 years, and that change may start coming from clients more than anything else. If I were to now take this discussion to the litigation side of AI, that's a whole different realm. As you know, the Supreme Court has come up or directed the Bar Council to come up with these huge guidelines they've made, because I think, and that's also social media linked, not just AI, where you can't be filming things in court and uploading and doing this, and different things they've gone over. And AI hallucinations of case laws are a bigger reality than anything that we've seen on the M&A or the deal side of things. And that's not just in India, but you've got US judges who have criticized AI in different courts, and case laws have been manufactured and generated and so on. And so
If
that,
you
to me, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
if you push the AI too hard, and if you really want to hear something, it will tell you that in a very convincing way. And that is
Correct.
something that we call hallucination.
Indeed, indeed. And so that is still work in progress. And
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
but
Absolutely.
again, you know, some of the drafting, AI can do some pretty good drafting now.
Yeah.
And that, to me, is also a big advantage. Of course, you now also are getting clients who send you an AI draft and say, hey, read this for me in 1 hour and clean it up for me, right?
Yeah. So it actually gives you a good base basically for you to work on. So I think,
Sure.
it eliminates a lot of timing, but you're right. I mean, like now clients are also kind of preparing briefs using AI, and then you have to work
Absolutely.
on top of that.
Absolutely.
So this was pretty good, Akhil. Thank you so much for this whole, M&A. I would call it M&A Ki Pathshala, which is a great kind of a ready reckoner for anybody, who wants to understand this better. Uh, Very, good overview. Now, I would want to ask you some very quick questions without giving you much of a time.
Okay.
So, this is more like on a personal front. Very often, yeah, I hear people giving recommendations on books or movies. Okay, I would want to have that recommendation from you as well. So, any one book or movie that you wanted to tell me that could give me a great insight on a business deal or a transaction.
I think, Art of a Deal by Donald Trump could be an interesting book to read, because I think, he's a true businessman and cutthroat at it, as we've seen even on the political side. And I think you get to understand a lot when you go through something like that in terms of how the other side is thinking.
Yes, that's a good one. There's that one legal rule you wish everybody understood. You'll have to sum it up in just one sentence. What is that one legal rule that everybody must understand?
I think I just say buyer beware. That's the legal maxim which we learn also. And it's a Latin phrase, but I'll just stick to the English version, which is buyer beware. I think that transcends our lives and the law, because when you go out to buy something, you need to make sure you're buying the right thing. And the same thing applies on the deal side of things. Lots of things are spruced up and made to look beautiful, but you got to beware.
Perfect, perfect. That's a great answer. The third one is that what is that most satisfying thank you would have gotten from any of your client?
Oh boy.
Even though,
Satis
even though,
oh,
you know,
mm.
a lot of service industry or professional services job is very thankless job, but still you recall that one good thank you that you still remember.
I think it was an email that I got from the CEO who was not actually directly involved in the deal, but who realized at the end of it what a tough deal it had been. And he took the time out and actually sent a thank you note and said that the deal would not have done without you on the table.
Okay, so that's a great appreciation. I think if somebody who's directly not involved and still writing you a mail is a good one. Thank you so much, Akil, for your time today. And it was, super fun talking to you. I still will remember that, marriage analogy when it comes to whenever I think of M&A, I would definitely remember that analogy. So thank you so much for your time today. And so that
Thank you.
was Akil
Thank you.
Hirani, managing partner, Majmudar and Partners. And we would come back to you with another episode of The Great Legal Minds with another great personality. Thank you so much for watching.